Today we will hear a review of Little Dancer Aged 14 by Camille Lawrence, and I'd like to read just a short excerpt from page 62. The garments ornamenting the little dancer paradoxically pointed to her essential anatomy. The clothed nude is more obscene than the naked. The visible suggests the hidden. Her nudity might be veiled, but one was led to think about it, to visualize the conditions under which art was made, to reflect on the mores of bohemia and the wantonness of models, provoking feelings of shame and hatred. With this sculpture, then, Degas transgressed twice over, breaking the rules of polite society and those of academic art. Our presenter today is Marlene Hammond-Whitmore, McPherson Director of Academic Programs at the Memorial Art Gallery of the University of Rochester. Marlene oversees the museum's initiatives for preschool through grade 12, collaborations with area colleges and universities, the docent and school tour programs, the Charlotte Whitney Allen Library, and MAG's art and wellness offerings. She looks forward to carving out more time to read in the future. Please join me in welcoming Marlene to our podium.
Good afternoon. So Susan, you know I can talk for 2.5 hours, but I think you all are not taking that long for lunch. So 20 minutes, 25 minutes? Are you going to give me the high sign if I get lost in my own head? All right, I might get lost in my head, so welcome to that. So I'll try to keep an eye on my watch, which is something I do very poorly. So good afternoon. Good afternoon. So, hi, Gary. Gosh, there were so many ways to do this, and probably so many other right ways and a few wrong ways. But at some point in time, April 30th was just kind of drawing nearer and nearer, and I just had to make a decision as how I was going to jump in and do this. And what I've done is, you know, what I might not have done 6 months ago and what I might not do in 6 months, but it's where we are for the next 20 minutes or so together. So I hope you'll join me on this adventure. I'm going to ask this question not because I'm going to make stuff up if the answer is no, but it just kind of helps me. How many of you have actually read the book? Okay, so I really can make stuff up. That's good to know. All right. But I'm not going to. It just kind of gives me an idea of where we're all at here. So, Little Dancer, age 14, the true story behind Degas' masterpiece. I had a good friend once who I'm sure quoted a wise person, much wiser than both of us together, that said, what I'm about to tell you is true. Now, whether it ever happened or not is a completely different story. So the whole idea of truth is one that we certainly are not going to even think about handling it in 20 minutes. But the story progresses in a very interesting way. And I, unfortunately, only speak one language, and that's English, and some days better than others. But when I read something translated from another language that is as deep and rich as I think this book really is in concept and approach, you can bet your bottom dollar I'm going to credit the translator Willard Wood, who I don't know anything at all about, I will tell you. If I had more hours, I would just keep going and going, but eventually I have to stop and put together the PowerPoint. It's a very, very interesting book, and it talks about many things, of course, not just this one particular sculpture. I'm going to use the word sculpture. I work in an art museum. I work at the Memorial Art Gallery. And if we have a work of art in our museum that is three-dimensional, it is a sculpture. If it is something that's in a park and is commemorative, in my line of work, you often call that a monument or a statue. So I'm just going to use the word sculpture. So I want to begin with Monsieur Degas himself. So here we have two early self-portraits. I so desperately want to move. But can you hear me if I do this? Sometimes I can't. Never ask more than one person a yes or no question. I'm sorry, I know that. So I will stay here. So two self-portraits out of the many, 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 many self-portraits that Degas did in his lifetime. And artists do self-portraits for really a couple reasons. Number one, they're always available. Number two, they don't have to pay themselves. And number three, they get to try things out when nobody else is watching. And quite often, the more self-portraits an artist does, I'm totally making this up, but this is my belief. The more self-portraits an artist does, the deeper their interest in draftsmanship, and the more they are curious about learning different ways of mark making. And Degas did self-portraits all through his life. Another person that you know well who did many, many, many self-portraits throughout his entire life was Rembrandt. So, and there are other artists as well. But to me, it's an indication of a very curious mind. You're always trying to work things out. You're always looking closely. And again, you can be relentless when you're doing a self-portrait. Sometimes not quite so relentless when you're doing a portrait for a commission. There's a short but fantastic little story that Degas did a portrait of Manet's wife, and Manet thought that Degas made his very beautiful wife not at all beautiful and ripped out that part of the canvas. So, you know, your friends are usually pretty honest with you. So, but you are most honest with yourself. So here we see Degas, who was both born and died in Paris, born in 1834, dies in 1917. So we see him as a young man of about 21 on the left, near the end of his life with one of his housekeepers. Degas never married. If he had any affairs with men or women, he was just about the most discreet human to have ever lived. There's almost no indication of that whatsoever. He was a beloved family member to brothers and nieces and nephews, and there are wonderful portraits that exist of his families together and portraits of his friends, whether they were very famous artists or writers, or just very smart people that he liked to hang around in the cafe and drink with and talk with. But as far as his personal life, he was a rather solitary figure. He spent a lot of time painting and drawing, and that seemed to really be what made him go. So here is one of his two housekeepers, and as soon as she died, she was very quickly replaced with another housekeeper. He had really just two housekeepers his entire life. He cherished them for their ability to care for him, to basically stay out of his way, to let him do what he wanted, and for their complete and total discretion. I would not be doing my employer, I would be doing my employer a great disservice if I didn't mention, these are two of the Degas that we have. We also have a racing picture, but it's out of the realm of what we're talking about today, so I didn't bring it in. But a wonderful pastel in charcoal on the left, which unfortunately is not currently on view. Have any of you ever seen that? It's been up, you know, it comes up every once in a while at the museum. Works of art on paper are very sensitive to light, and so there's a rule in museum, it's like for every 6 months something is on view, it must be off for 18 months. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's something like that. So it does not come out that often, but it's a wonderful pastel on the left. And then we see a bronze sculpture on the right, which is currently on view. Bronze can be up pretty much indefinitely all the time, everywhere, anywhere, in any type of light, and even out of doors. It's just about one of the most durable materials an artist can work with. And this bronze is on view in our collection upstairs. And this was made from a wax original. This was made from the same material originally that Degas made the Little Dancer out of. So how long was Degas interested in depicting dancers? Really his entire life. The ballet was, I don't think there is a contemporary in our society for the ballet in Paris in the 19th century. I don't think there is anything that filled such a large part of both the public and private imagination as the Paris Ballet. It was attended primarily by members of the upper class, many of whom were men. Some went with their wives or their mistresses. But the dancers were definitely from the lower class. They were usually quite impoverished. They often danced with their female siblings whenever possible. They were always escorted by their mothers. It was rigorous. It was painful. It was difficult. These are words that don't even describe going to rehearsal day after day after day after day for hours on end, being beaten with a stick by the ballet master if you didn't get your pose quite right. I have never danced. If that's not obvious yet, I don't know the terminology. I'm not even going to pretend to know the terminology. I do know when we get to the little dancer what position she's in because I read about it, but I am not a dancer. I was a tumbler when I was 3, which means I did somersaults. That was kind of it. So, not a dancer. But the whole allure of the dance was interesting, fascinating to Parisians for many, many reasons. They're beautiful young girls. They're beautiful young girls who are growing into women. There's costumes, there's lighting, there's makeup, there's fantasy. I mean, this was really before one could go to the cinema, for the most part, to see a motion picture, so it's escapism. I mean, we go to see the Avengers because it kind of takes our mind off everything else for a while. If it doesn't, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing on some level. So it was fantasy, it was escape, it was beautiful. There's music. So it not only delighted the eyes, but the ears. All of the senses were engaged in this really fantastic, other than daily life spectacle, and that was the ballet. Degas almost always exhibited with the Impressionists, but he did not like the term. He was not at all an Impressionist. He very much considered himself a realist. And I think the term in the book was he was considered himself a traditionalist, perhaps, but he was definitely not an Impressionist. One of his quotes is, there was never any art more calculated than mine. He didn't just get it down quickly. He would study the model. He would walk around the model. He would poke the model. He would feel the model. He would get up close to the model. And that's when his eyesight was still good. From middle age on, Degas' eyesight gradually almost completely left him. He was almost blind, if not completely blind, by the time he died, which was one of the reasons he would eventually leave draftsmanship, drawing and painting behind, and just work on sculpture, because with that he could, quote unquote, see. But he spent a great deal of time in the rehearsal halls and backstage, as a lot of men did at that point in time in the ballet. But as far as we know, Degas never took a young ballerina as a mistress, which was really the norm. I'm not here to judge, so I'm not going there. But it was very, very common for upper-class men to go to the ballet during the day, during rehearsal time. I guess they didn't have to be at work, so it worked out for everybody. But and they would be in the wings, and they would watch rehearsal. And they would pick out a favorite ballerina if they didn't have one already. And there were often then negotiations with the young woman's mother. And it may lead to an apartment in Paris. It was almost always going to eventually lead to an intimate physical relationship and caring for the girl. Sometimes money was exchanged, not just with the girl, but with the girl's family, with the mother. It was a way to make a living for a lot of these young ballerinas, and it was a way for them to help support their family. But to the best of any historical knowledge, this was not what Degas did, which made him a bit of an oddity in his own time. But he did spend a lot of time at rehearsals and at performances, drawing and drawing and drawing, and then hiring certain young dancers to come into his studio. And one of them was Marie van Goethe. So she was born in Belgium in 1875. So let's go. Here we see an early drawing, an early chalk drawing of a dancer that we now recognize as Marie van Goethe. Her name was Marie Genevieve van Goethe. Her parents were Belgian. They had emigrated to Paris to escape poverty like so many of their countrymen and so many others from Italy and Poland, and had settled at the foot of Montmartre in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Her mother was a laundress, her father a tailor. Marie was born in Paris, her older sister was born in Belgium. She was born in Paris on June 7th, 1865, the second of 3 sisters. The eldest, Antoinette, had been born in Brussels in 1861 and posed for Degas first, starting at age 12. She went on to become a prostitute and, driven by hunger, a petty thief, working alone or with her mother, and she eventually served time in the Saint-Lazare prison for women. The youngest, Louise Josephine, joined the Paris Opera as a quote-unquote little rat, which was what these girls were called. They were called little rats. That was the common terminology. So her younger sister, Louise Josephine, joined the Paris Opera as a little rat at the same time as Marie. Of the three sisters, Marie had the least tragic life. Louise Josephine, the youngest sister, had the least tragic life. She was selected for the Corps de Ballet and later became a successful dance teacher. One of her pupils was the great Yvette Chauvier, and it's always intriguing with siblings to see how fate works different embroideries on the same canvas of sufferings. And hats off to the translator on that sentence. The youngest, less brutalized by their aging mother, perhaps has the advantage of a more moderate temperament, or else loved dance sufficiently to carve a place for herself in that world, turning a constraint imposed by her mother into an avenue of salvation. Degas might have met the sisters or their mother around the Paris neighborhood where they lived. During the 20 years from 1862, when they arrived in Paris, to 1882, when we mostly lose track of the family, the Van Gotham family was registered at 7 different addresses, always in the 9th arrondissement, near the Place Pigalle. These successive moves likely reflect that they were skipping out on their rent after missing several payments in a row and finding the landlord increasingly insistent, or else that they were trying to escape charges of prostitution. Degas also relocated several times while staying in the same general area, Rue Blanche, Rue Pigalle, Rue Fontaine, Rue Balou, and Boulevard de Clichy, where he lies buried today in the Montmartre Cemetery. That part of Paris was also where the greater part of Bohemia lived, alongside workers, shopkeepers, and employees, a stratum of society known in French as la blouse, for the loose-fitting smock its members often wore at work. So here we see a drawing of Marie Van Gotham. She is not identified as such on the drawing, but we recognize that it is she by her face, by her pose, because she is identified here. So here we see one of Degas' little dancers, or actually one of the original little dancers, age 14, that was made by Degas between 1878 and 1881. Now I'd like you to take a look at the materials that go into this piece here. So pigmented beeswax, which is mixed with clay. It's mixed with plasticine clay. You've probably all touched plasticine clay. So it's modeling clay. It's that greasy clay that if you have it in your cupboard from when you were 6, you could find it and it would still be that greasy clay that's been in your cupboard since you were 6. I don't know how it never dries out, but it never dries out. So it's pigmented beeswax. I know because I still have mine somewhere. And I found it. I was like, wow, I could still use this. So pigmented beeswax, plasticine clay, metal armature, rope, paintbrushes, human hair, silk and linen ribbon, a bodice made out of a cotton, woven cotton material, silk tutu, linen slippers, so real ballet slippers, and all of it put on a wooden base. The original piece that Degas showed in 1881 was about 39 inches tall, so 3 feet and change. It was very important to Degas that his sculptures were always less than life size. Very important that they were always less than life size. Because around this point in time, Rodin had been accused of making casts directly from his models. So you would see a Rodin sculpture, not all of them, but you might see a Rodin sculpture and say, my God, that looks exactly like his model Camille, and that might be because he actually made casts before he did the bronze. He didn't always work like that. If you're carving marble, you can't work like that. If you are pouring bronze, then you actually can make a plaster cast. So Degas was never going to get caught in that trap that he was actually making casts from the human body. He wanted people to know that this was his skill level, which was incredibly, incredibly high. So the first little dancer, which was exhibited in the Impressionist show, because that really, at that point in time, was the only game in town, if you were an adventurous sort, and if you were an artist who was not showing in the state-run salon, where the work was what we would now describe at this day and age very neoclassical, incredibly traditional, and there was no experimentation at all invited into the salon. So the Impressionists who worked together, showed together, were all really pushing boundaries. And, as is often the case, those are the artists that we remember, the ones that really push boundaries. So, we see a drawing here of Marie van Guthum, about 1878, 1879, which leads us to one of the finished pieces. And I want you to notice the face, especially, I guess in this shot, it would be the one on the far right. I don't know if that's easy enough for you to say. But Degas is not doing a portrait at all of Marie van Guthum. He's actually giving us his reaction to this particular dancer. There's the idea of a portrait of a person versus a portrait of an idea or an ideal figure. So he is using Marie van Guthum as a point of departure. In the drawing, he is drawing exactly what is before him. When he's working on the sculpture, he's starting to take a little bit, just a little bit, of artistic license. So I read from page 50 in the book. At this juncture, we may be startled to realize that Marie van Guthum probably did not look like Degas' sculpture, that what we see is not her true face, for he also gave those features to others, to men older than she, to women in a shadowy brothel, to a well-known cabaret singer. He probably flattened the top of her skull and altered her facial angle to make her jutting chin a kind of plebeian muzzle, as he wrote in one of his poems. When we look at the preparatory drawings for this sculpture, we see how he changed her face to give it the hallmarks of a savage quasi-Neanderthal primitivism, a precocious degeneracy. He literally altered her nature. The contrast with the delicate portraits Degas made of his own sister Marguerite, who had fine features, a genteel oval face, and neatly combed hair, is extreme. It's hard not to loathe this 40-something conformist who, in modeling his wax, manipulated a very young girl for reasons that have nothing to do with art or aesthetics. Art need not be an exact imitation of life, but must we accept that a young creature be sacrificed to the suspect ideology of the artist? So what Degas was doing to some extent was taking the young girl and altering her features to a phrenology, if you will, that let people know she was less than. This plebeian Neanderthal who was impoverished, who was a little rat of the opera, and not one of his beautiful young high-class, upper-class nieces dressed in a tutu. How does he make the sculptures? The making of the sculptures, as I said, is done primarily with a mixture that only Degas really knew of beeswax and plasticine. And he did that so that he could constantly rework them. If it was beeswax alone, it would have cracked and it would have dried out. If it was plasticine alone, he wouldn't have the malleability that he got, and he wouldn't be able to reproduce the translucency and the texture of skin, which he got when he mixed these materials together. But not only did he mix the materials together, he actually would just grab things in his studio and stick them into the wax as he was making the sculpture. So here you see an x-ray on the right of one of the waxes, and you can see the armature clearly, and you might not be able to see other stuff stuck in the x-ray, but you can see it on the bottom. So what I'm showing you on the left, let's hope my top is on, is the bottom of the sculpture. All right, that's the bottom of the sculpture. And on the right, you can see that wire armature that's supporting especially the leg that's moving forward. So he would do this. Now this is where probably the only time I vehemently disagree with the author of the book, that he was just grabbing crap from his studio, like a broken cork and a broken paintbrush handle and wire, and all of these things that were meant to be discarded as poor Marie van Guthum was going to be discarded by the entire city of Paris when she was no longer young enough and pretty enough to be a ballerina. That's absolute hooey. He is grabbing a cork and a broken paintbrush and whatever else he can do to stick into the wax model because it's about to tip over, or he's about to lose the arm, and he's just grabbing things to fortify the wax. You can't see them. They're in there. They're underneath, but they're building up the subsistence of the sculpture itself There's no metaphor whatsoever. It was an interesting piece of writing, but that was really the one thing I have to completely and totally disagree with. An artist will use what he or she has at hand at the moment to make it work, but it is quite interesting. Now, what he showed us in 1881 at the first Impressionist show was met with complete and total derision. People had never seen such a thing. They had never seen this young girl who we know he had to sculpt her naked, because he wouldn't have gotten it. So Susan referred to that in her passage. We know he drew and sculpted this young girl when she was naked. That's an obscene thing. He's showing us this young girl. We don't know who she is. She's not a prima ballerina. She actually wasn't good enough, and or she had to miss practice so many times because she had other jobs to help support the family that she was cut from the corps, and or she was cut from the corps because she was making much better money modeling for Degas than she was when she was performing, so that was another reason. So she doesn't make it as a ballerina. But I think probably another thing that really got to folks is her attitude. Look at that chin. Look at that chin. How many of you ever taught school? Anybody? So this is your third grade girl who is just giving you fits. But if you can hang on and she can hang on, she's the one who's going to be a venture capitalist when she gets out of college. I mean, this is total attitude. And the people who are going to see the exhibitions are people from the upper class and the upper middle class. And this is a complete and total affront to them. This young girl has complete and total agency. She's fine. She's fine. In her mind, I can hear her saying, what you think of me is none of my business. So Degas enjoyed drawing her. We see her again in this pastel from 1884. It's definitely Marie van Gutten. We see her again. And then she really falls away. And in the last chapter of the book, so you guys haven't read it. Are you guys going to read it? So here's like the spoiler alert. I don't know if I should go here. I'm going to go there a little. So in the last chapter of the book, the author starts to really realize where her gaps in research are. And she really kind of doubles up her game and does some more research and finds out a little bit more. How many of you are watching Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr.? So stay with me. I have a point. I actually do. So that's been a fascinating show for me to watch. Just watching how deep you can actually go in the hands of a professional archivist. So she actually, at the end of the book, realizes how many gaps she has about Marie van Gutten. Even though she herself wasn't famous, she became really the product or was the impetus for one of the most famous pieces of art in the 19th century, and probably one of the most beloved, because as you know, you can buy this on socks and mugs and pillowcases. And in doing my research, I found this on all kinds of things that I thought was a little odd, but to each their own. But she herself became almost invisible, and yet here she is. We're talking about her now, so she does live on. But she loses track of Marie because the city of Paris loses track of Marie. Soon after Degas finishes his piece, the years go by, and I trust that an archivist will come along at some point in time and do a little bit more research. But there are parallels with the writer's own past that parallels so beautifully the life of the young Marie. And that's, to me, the very last chapter is, gosh, I almost wish this had been in the beginning of the book. So I do encourage you to read it, because it is really quite fascinating. And if you do read it, you'll understand where I'm going with the Henry Louis Gates Finding Your Roots reference. But here we see the original wax. So the original waxes that Degas made, and he made many, many in his own lifetime. This was the only one that he ever showed in his own lifetime in the Impressionist exhibition of 1881. And it was met with such cries of derision. What is he doing? She looks like she should be in a natural history museum. She looks like an animal. Why is he making it out of wax? What kind of sculptor makes something out of such an impermanent material? Look, she's impudent. Why are you putting clothes on this doll, but it's not even a doll? People didn't know what it was. It didn't fit in a category, which of course is why it's so fabulous. The original stayed in Degas' studio. He reworked it many times because, again, that plasticine beeswax, it's a thing. You can go home and you can try it, work up some kind combination, he could constantly go back and rework these wax sculptures. And again, as his eyesight continued to leave him late in life, the sculpture was really the way he made art. He no longer could draw. But Paul Mellon, here we see, Paul Mellon acquired the original after Degas' death. And after Degas' death, many of the waxes were taken from the studio, plaster casts were made, and then small bronzes were made, and they are in museums and private collections all over the world. That's where the one from the mag came from as well. But here is the original with the collector Paul Mellon. I love this photograph. And she is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. But there are bronze copies of this in museums and private collections all over the world as well. And then just doing research, I love this photograph. This is the twins. This is interesting because actually you see Paul Mellon is a twin. Do you see his reflection in the glass? So here's Paul Mellon, his twin, and staring, thinking goodness knows what as he looks. She's a much cuter twin, I think, actually. So here we see this young girl, the twins and Degas from 1990. And this is a very moving photograph. I'd never seen this before. Had you guys seen this one before? This one you thought you saw every photograph of Marilyn Monroe there ever was. I never saw this one. And I could not find the photographer. I wasn't really sure. So I need to keep looking. But this particular bronze version was in the home of a private collector at a party that Marilyn Monroe was at, and I just think this is heartbreakingly beautiful. I love this photograph. Does anybody know the photographer? No, I'll find it. I'll find it, I will. Degas was also very interested in photography and took photographs of dancers primarily. So he really comes into photography at its birth, at its origins, and he used photography primarily to inform his own work, but he also used photography as a means to an end. He would, quote unquote, make art photographs as well, but it was also a way of posing his dancers in the studio, making the photograph. The dancer could go home, and then he could work from the photograph in the dancer's absence. It's a little bit cheaper that way. And Degas might have been a tough old bird, and he might have been a rather solitary figure, and neither of those things are a bad thing. Takes all kinds to make a world. And he dies in 1917, surrounded by family. And here he is with some very good friends in the year 1903, as you see on the bottom of the photograph, kind of dancing in the driveway with a couple good friends. So he was a private man, and for that I give him a great deal of respect. His work was quite beautiful, very intriguing. It asks a lot of questions. It gives us a couple answers, but it asks more questions than it gives us answers, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so interesting 100 and some years later. So, thank you.